Hey everybody, welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields, and this is episode 4 of our Pints and Process series. So we have our pint, let's talk about the process. So far in this series, we've talked about building a recipe, what ingredients are in there, how to build a recipe. We've also talked about water chemistry, adding salts to that, and then we did our last episode on the mash and what happens in your mash tun. Episode 4, we're going to be talking about the lautering process. So grab a beer, hit that like and subscribe button, and stay tuned. In the last episode, we talked all about the mash and what was happening in your mash tun. So we added the water, the grains, they converted starches to sugars, etc. Now we're talking about getting that liquid out of the grains. And that's essentially what the lautering process is all about. It's the separating of your wort from, that's within your mash from the grains. And so why is this important? Well, there's a couple different reasons. It helps the clarity of your beer long term. It helps prevent any astringent or bitter flavors from taking place while you have grains or other proteins and particles in your boil. It also helps with better efficiency. So breweries are really interested in this. They want to use as little of product as possible to get the same amount, right? And so it helps save them money in the long run if they have to use less grains. And so by recirculating and things we'll talk about today, they save money. And then also it maintains consistency, especially for home brewers. So from batch to batch to batch, you can maintain a consistent level of your beer quality time after time after time. And so there's really 3 steps in lautering process. There is the mash out, or your initial runnings. There is the recirculation or Vorlaufing, and then there's sparging. And let's talk about each one individually. So the first one is mash out or your initial runnings. So in some cases, if you brew in a bag, for instance, you would do what they call a mash out. And a mash out essentially is raising the temperature of your mash to over 170 degrees, and that stops the starch conversion. But if you do this in a Rubbermaid container like myself, we wouldn't do that, right? And so you would just take your initial running. So basically you're going to be draining that initial strike water that you put in from your grains. And the grains are going to help filter and screen the liquid so you get clearer and clearer beer out of it, all right? And so you're going to be taking that first initial volume and you're going to be pouring it out. And that kind of leads us into the recirculation or the Vorlaufing process. And so in a brewery setting, what they would do is they'd recirculate with pumps, and they would pump that back on top of the grains, and then they would kind of let that recirculate, and that helps set the grain bed. When you use a Rubbermaid cooler like I do, so we don't have pumps, so what I do is I drain a little bit of the wort into a pitcher, and you open the valve slowly. That helps set the grain bed, right? And so the grains inside will collect around a screen that you have or a false bottom in your Rubbermaid container, and then it will drain out. And what it's doing is essentially collecting a lot more grains against that screen, and it's helping filter the grains and proteins out of the wort. And what you're left over with after a couple cycles of doing this, you'll fill up the pitcher, slowly dump it back over, fill it up again, slowly dump it back over again, and you'll do this several times. This helps clarify the beer. The first time that you fill up that pitcher, it's going to be cloudy, there's going to be grain particles in there, but as that grain bed sets, you're going to have less and less and less of that in the pitcher. And so doing this 5-6 times, even though it's several gallons of wort, is going to help get you clearer beer. It's going to help you prevent those off flavors. And I didn't do this enough when I first started homebrewing, admittedly. I would do about 1 of those pitchers and I didn't see any chunks floating around, and I said, well, right into the kettle. But as I've gotten better at brewing, I've realized the importance of that Vorlaufing process, and the clarity of my beer has gotten a lot better after that. And so this is specifically, the Vorlaufing portion is specifically for the clarity, but it's also for preventing any of those astringent flavors from getting into your beer and making it into the boil, right? And then we have sparging. And sparging is essentially once you're done, you're left with the husks and the other particles that are left inside of your mash tun. And then you need to basically rinse those grains off to help you get as much of the sugar content from those grains off as possible. And there's a couple different ways that home brewers do this. There's either called fly sparging or continuous sparging or batch sparging, right? So fly sparging is where you trickle water essentially over it, hot water, as you're doing your initial running to begin with. So you start your Vorlauf process, but then you would open it up, you'd start draining in your kettle very slowly, and then you'd have what they call a Lautering, or a different container having very hot water, like 170, 180 degrees, and then that would trickle over slowly over the wort. And you'd want to make sure you maintain that level in your mash tun where the liquid is about 1 inch over the top of the bed. And this can sometimes take 45 minutes or so, if you're doing it correctly, to slowly rinse off the grain. So you're essentially getting all of your sugar water that has been created in your mash tun, and you're taking the hot water on top, and it's slowly basically filtering all that, you're rinsing off the grains. But a lot of people go to the batch sparge method, and that's exactly what I do. And so what I do is I actually drain all of the liquid out of my first runnings, and then I close my valve. I dump in hot water to let that sit for another 5, 10, 15 minutes. I usually do between 10 and 15 minutes. That helps heat the grains up to that 170 level and really stop that starch conversion. But then also helps me rinse off the grains again. So what I do is then do that Vorlaufing process once again. I mix up the grains, of course, do that Vorlaufing process once again and get it really clear. And then I can elect all of my runnings, or my second runnings, or my final runnings outside of that, doing the same process we did when I was draining my initial runnings. So after you have your full boil volume in your kettle, then you can start the boil process, and that's the next step in the next video. However, I do want to talk about stuck sparges, because this happens to the best of us. If you've been brewing for a while, you've probably had one. If you haven't, I would probably say you haven't been brewing long enough, or you're just very good at what you do, because all of us at one point or another will come across a stuck sparge. And essentially that means that your grains either have collected too much on your or you have a different style of equipment that didn't let the grains drain enough, or you're using ingredients that would make it difficult for the liquid to get out of your mash tun. And so we'll talk a little bit about each of those. So it depends on your equipment, of course. So they make false bottoms and the Bazooka screens like I use in mine, specifically for home brewing, because it has the right amount of open spaces. It will still collect the grains, but it also will allow the water or the wort to flow through it. And so you want to make sure that you're using equipment that will allow that process to take place. The second one I will talk about is your grain mill. Whether you do that at a homebrew supply store or if you have your own mill, that mill is important because you want it to be broken up enough where you can get all of this, starches and sugars out of the grains, but you don't want to be too fine where it's so sawdust almost that it's going to stick to your false bottom or your screen and not allow you to flow liquid through it. And so there's a happy medium in there, and that is really important when you're setting up your grain mill or your homebrew supply store. And so the homebrew supply stores generally will be okay, but sometimes they can be too much or too little. And so you want to make sure that it's right on the money. If you get your own grain mill, you can set that up yourself. It should be about the thickness of a credit card between the mills inside of your grain mill. Each grain mill will have its own settings, right? And you can adjust them with little knobs, but use the spacing that they recommend for their grain mill. Some will have 2 rollers, some will have 3, so they're all a little bit different. But having too little or too much can affect your Vorlaufing and your Lautering process. You also need to make sure that you're draining a little bit slower. So when you open up your mash tun to start draining in Vorlaufing, you want to make sure that you're not just cranking it all the way open. You really want to take your valve and open it very slowly. Let that grain bed collect slowly on the bottom to help filter your wort. Because if you do it too quickly, it can actually jam up a little bit too much and get a little bit too concentrated around the screen, and therefore it compacts, and then you'll end up getting a stuck sparge. And then lastly is about ingredients and what kind of beer that you're making. So if you're using things like wheat and rye and oats or flaked barley, those ingredients don't have hulls on the outside of them, and so the fact is that they gum up a little bit more and they compact against your screen. And so to combat that, you would use rice hulls. And rice hulls are typically found at your homebrew supply store, and they act as a filter, kind of preventing the gummy or clumps of ingredients in your mash tun, and it allows that wort to flow out a little bit more. So your mash tun could be set up correctly. You're just using ingredients, and depending on how many of those ingredients that you're using, the oats, rye, flake barley, things like that, depends on how much rice hulls you use. But a good rule of thumb is somewhere between 1/4 pound to 1/2 pound in a 5-gallon batch. And so if you're doing a hazy IPA and you have 30% of your grain bill is these other more gummy types of ingredients, I would opt to go to about 1/2 pound for sure, right? Stuck sparges happen anyway. Sometimes to the best of us, sometimes you can still use rice hulls and all of a sudden maybe you didn't use enough or whatever, and you get one. And that's just probably going to happen over time. So how do how can you fix that during your brew day process? Not all is lost necessarily, right? So if you're first starting out your Vorlauf or your first runnings and you're starting to get a stuck sparge, you can stop your valve, you can stir back up the ingredients, and you can actually add rice hulls at that point. And so even if you didn't add enough and you need to add more, they don't need to be in there for the full mash. You can remix them in later on if you have them, or you can restart it. Maybe you were opening your valve a little bit too fast, and so you can stop that, you can mix it back up if there's enough liquid volume in there, right? But say you're getting down towards about halfway through and all of a sudden you get a stuck sparge. Well, there's a couple of different ways that you can fix that too. One is by, if you're using a kettle for your mash tun, you can heat it up, right? So heating up the liquid to over 170 degrees actually decreases the viscosity, and it allows that liquid to flow through the grains a little bit easier than they would when they're a little bit cooler. If you don't, you use a Rubbermaid container like I do, you can actually just add hot water to it, right? And so you can add some degree of warmer water, 180, 190 degrees, depending on how much you need to add to the top of it to get your mash to 170 degrees or maybe a little bit higher to loosen up and decrease that viscosity. So, and then last but not least, if you're still, after all of that, you're still having a stuck sparge, what you can do is you can actually scoop out or dump out your mash tun into a different vessel with a big paint strainer bag or a different filter bag over the top, and then you can lift out essentially the grains, and it will help filter out the wort, and you can save that wort for your full boil volume. And so brew in a bag is a different method, right? And so if you use brew in a bag, or maybe you use an electric system that is similar to brew in a bag, where you're not using a different mash tun, you're actually boiling in the same exact vessel that you're going to be doing, and you just rinse, or you lift out either a bag or you lift out the insert in a electric system. That is essentially using one of the three processes, right? You're really just doing the mash out portion. So you can heat that water up in advance to that 170 mark to make it easier for the liquid to drain out of either your basket or your bag that you have. But you're really not going to be doing much of the recirculation or the sparging, right? And so it is a process a lot of people do. Brew in a bag, you're lifting it out, you're letting that wort drain, but you're not getting to recirculate, and you're not doing the sparging method to rinse it out. So you may find that you need to use a little bit more grains to get to the same level that someone who does fly sparging or batch sparging would, but that would be accounted for sometimes in your calculator depending on how you're setting it up. Like Brewer's Friend, for instance, or Beersmith, they may ask you what style of system that you're using, and that kind of accounts for how much grains or what your expected gravities would be based on what system that you're using. It also doesn't make your beer quite as clear, and so you may want to add things like Irish moss or a Vorlauf tablet to your boil to help drop out some of those other sediment or grain particles at the end of your boil process. Those will drop out, and in your primary fermenter, they'll drop to the bottom a little bit more quickly if you add those things. And so there's a bunch of different ways of brewing, and brew in a bag is no different than using some other system, but the lautering process is limited when you do something like brew in the bag or an electric system. So next we're going to be talking on episode 5 about the boil process. What happens in the boil process? We're going to talk about volumes, we're going to be talking about hop additions, we're going to be talking about bittering hops versus whirlpool hops versus what to expect during your boil process to prevent boilovers, etc. So with that, hit that like and subscribe button. I hope you've learned something today. Please leave me any comments in the video description below. I love reaching out and getting in touch with other folks that like to brew. That's what this channel is all about. So with that, again, like and subscribe, and cheers.